Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're here with Bence Nanay. Bence, am I saying your last name correctly, Nanay?
You're saying my last name correctly. You're not saying my first name correctly. It's Bence.
Okay, sorry. That one I thought was easy. How do you
Like
pronounce
Bence.
it? Benza. Okay, Benza Nanay. Okay, nice to be with you, Benza. You're a professor of philosophy and BOF research professor at the Center of Philosophical Psychology at the University of Antwerp, correct? That's what I see on your
Yeah,
website.
you're right.
Great. You're also a senior research associate with the University of Cambridge. So, what kind of work do you do in both of those disciplines?
Well, so I'm a philosopher, but I'm the kind of philosopher who's paying a lot of attention to the empirical sciences. So I'm trying to unify our understanding of the mind as it comes from philosophy, psychology, neuroscience. So that's the kind of philosophy I do, and I try to apply this to various different subfields of philosophy. So obviously that works the best in philosophy of mind, philosophy of perception. But I think that this kind of methodology also works very well in aesthetics and philosophy of art. So which is, I guess, which is what we're going to talk about more today.
Correct. Yep. Do you must touch on epistemology quite a bit. That was the discipline that I spent most of my studies on.
Yeah, I do, although not as much as you might think. So my main thing, I guess, is philosophy of perception, and like for a very long period of time, like in the second half of the 20th century, people were interested in perception because of epistemology. So the idea is that, well, we're interested in knowledge. That's what we're interested in, philosophers, and perception is one source of knowledge. So let's look into what perception is. But that's not really, recently that kind of got flipped around and people are interested in perception in its own right. And of course, knowledge is one thing that you can get from perception, but perception is good for all kinds of other things. For example, action guidance helps us perform actions and so on. So I think that I don't really think of philosophy of perception as the handmaiden of epistemology.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair. Yeah. Great. And that's a good clarification. We're going to talk a little bit, hopefully, a little bit more about the discipline of aesthetics and the philosophy of perception that you focus on. I spent some time with your book, A Very Short Introduction to Aesthetics. That's published through Oxford, correct? If I remember
Yes,
correctly.
Oxford University
Yeah.
Press,
And I'll put
2019.
a link. Yeah, I'll put a link to that book up on our website. But I think I want to jump in talking a little bit about film because that's an interest that I have, and you've spent obviously a lot of time in working with film and through the philosophy of perception and in your professional life. I've studied that, I assume. So I want to spend a little bit of time on that. The medium to me is really attractive. If I have a choice to, spend time reading a book or watching a movie, I tend to gravitate towards watching a movie. And I think sometimes that's because I'm lazy and movies do a lot of the thinking for you, and you just sit there and consume. But I also find movies super intriguing because they have to do a lot in a very short period of time. And the movies that are well crafted do that very well. The ones that aren't well crafted do that very poorly, and you can kind of see that contrast, right?
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about your work as a film critic. You've served as the jury on major film festivals, something that you say in your book that you've gotten out of for very specific reasons, and I want to explore that with you. But I think in those contexts, you really have to toe the line between what you call in your book having aesthetic experiences and performing aesthetic judgment. And maybe we can get into talking about film through that introducing those ideas. Like what is that distinction for you? And then how do you approach that as you're either watching a film just for enjoyment or to have an aesthetic experience versus maybe doing it professionally? Because I think a lot of us, particularly the people that are listening or reading this interview, tend to watch movies more for the experience, right? To relax or to do whatever. So how do you think about those two dynamics when you're looking at a film or thinking about how films should be consumed?
Yeah, great question. So, but before I get started on this, let me just say that I don't think that you're lazy for preferring film to literature. Watching films can be actually fairly demanding sometimes. I mean, depending on the film, it can take a fair amount of work, and reading books can be, if it's a page turner, it can really go by fast. So I don't think you're lazy. I don't think that those of us who are interested in film are doing it out of laziness. That's what I think myself anyway.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. So you want to jump in with this distinction between aesthetic experience and aesthetic judgment, and I think it's a really important distinction. So in general, it's important to make a distinction between an experience, a perceptual experience, and a judgment. So if I'm looking at my laptop, I have a perceptual experience, and when I then come to a judgment that my laptop is, I don't know, old or something, then that's a judgment. So judgment is something like a statement that you tell yourself, some kind of propositional attitude, and perceptual experience is a perceptual state. It has a temporally unfolding dynamics. So they're very different things. And then the question is, what is it that aesthetics is about? What is it that aesthetic engagement is all about? So is it about aesthetic experiences or is it about aesthetic judgment? And I am very heavily on the aesthetic experience side, and I think I'm going against with a fair amount of traditional thinking within, at least within analytic aesthetics, that tend to put the emphasis on aesthetic judgment. So Immanuel Kant wrote this famous book called The Critique of Judgment, which is one of the main founding texts of Western aesthetics. And it's about, and it's right there in the title. It's about aesthetic judgment. It's about a judgment, and he's interested in aesthetic judgments and not really about aesthetic experience. Although for him, the two things are a little more intertwined than for other people. And the other major source of thinking in aesthetics in Western aesthetics, at least, is David Hume's famous essay. It's called On the Standards of Taste. And the main example that it starts with is two people pronouncing different judgments, and then they disagree and how we can think about this, and lots of people. So the example is a little different and complicated and less fun to talk about. But if you watch a film, let's say we watch the latest Nolan film, Tenet, and you love it and I hate it, then we have different aesthetic judgments about it. And then Hume is interested in that question: how can we resolve these kinds of disagreement? But that, again, that's about judgment. It's about judgment. Now, why do I think that experience is more important than judgment? Well, the reason why I think that is because first of all, very often you're engaging with an artwork, and maybe you don't come to a judgment. You leave the movie, you leave the cinema, and you just think that, well, I don't know how I feel about this. Maybe I should come again. That does happen. No, does it happen to you?
It does. Yeah, for sure.
So in that case, you had 2 hours of aesthetic experience, which you might have really gotten a lot out of, but there's no judgment that accompanies it. So it seems to me that what we really care about, I mean, we spend a lot of time and money on aesthetic engagement, and the reason why we do this is not so that we can pronounce judgments on it. It's that it gives us valuable experiences.
So that's a really interesting point. Let me probe that a little bit. So when I have an aesthetic experience or any experience, let's say I go on vacation or have sex or whatever it is, right? If I have those experiences and I'm approaching those as an experience, I'm constantly saying, am I having fun? Or is this pleasurable? Or, like you're constantly thinking through that. You don't go through like value neutral, those experiences value neutral, right? I traveled to Europe in the fall. And obviously, like when I look back, it was a great trip. I had a fantastic time. But while I was there, I was constantly, looking for the next thing to do and where do I want to go eat. And so when you say like you can go to a film and you leave and say, I don't know what I think about that, is that really true? Like, do we, like you can say experientially that was pleasurable or displeasurable, even though I don't make a judgment on the quality of the film or how the actors did. I want to go back and watch it again so I can make those kinds of judgments. So can you talk about that nuance a little bit?
Sure, and I think that you're right. It happens a lot that you're watching a film or you're going on vacation and you're constantly right. So when I'm talking about the opposition of experience and judgment, I'm not saying that when you have an experience, you never somehow reflect on that, right? And that's part of how an experience unfolds. That you have an experience and then you're somehow reflect on it. Am I doing this right? Should I be paying attention to something else? Should I be paying attention to this? So this takes me to another. So yeah, right. So when you're watching a film or when you're on vacation in Europe, that happens again, right? That happens quite often. That you're all right. So I go and I don't know, I visit Luxembourg, and so someone told me that it's a nice one. And I spent 2 days, and like, is it really worth my time? Is this really what I want to do with my life? And then maybe I reflect on it and I go away. So I think that it's having an experience doesn't mean that you're just it's some kind of unreflected, pure kind of pleasure machine kind of thing. It's something that that is very much informed by your higher cognitive processes and influenced by them. But it's still very different from a judgment, right? It's still so some like an aesthetic experience that's heavily influenced by what I know or what I'm trying to do. That's different from making a judgment. Maybe that's a good point to plug in this thing, because I think that what you're getting at is really important and also really underappreciated in Western aesthetics, and that's the fact that aesthetic experience is often things that we're very deliberately are trying to have, or like we're acting on it. So it's not something that somehow washes over us. I mean, sometimes it is. Sometimes that's exactly what happens. I mean, it's just some really strong experience. But most often, what happens is that we kind of know that we should have an aesthetic experience because all my friends told me it's an amazing movie. I'm standing there and I'm trying, right? So I'm making an effort to try to be in the zone. And I think it's even more important, when you're a teenager and listening to music and you're really trying to get into it and you're really trying to feel it, right? That's also something that you do, like you're actively, deliberately trying to do. And that's something that's not really appreciated within contemporary aesthetics. And I think it's a very important part, and it's exactly what you've been pointing at.
Yeah, and I think it's hard, particularly for philosophers. We're in our head a lot, so we're always constantly evaluating and analyzing, and it's hard to I think it's hard to get out of our heads and just enjoy something without doing that analytic work. I want to piggyback on that question. You wrote something in chapter 6 that resonated with me. You said a good way of characterizing at least some forms of aesthetic experiences that it feels as if it's the very first time we are having the experience. And I really like that because, and I talk about, watching The Dark Knight, for example. That was one of the examples I used in when I was writing to you. And when I watch that film, it's amazing to me how I can watch it and it does feel almost like it's the first time I'm seeing it, because I'll notice different things, or I'll notice the way the camera moved and focused on something that I missed the first 5 times or whatever. And it does have that newness, right? And you watch the performances and how intense the actors are when they're playing their parts, and there's some nuances there. And then you read a little bit of background in some of the actors, and then you bring that into how you watch the film, right? So it sort of is that feeling of its newness, right? Now let's go back to what we just talked about, where you have that kind of non-analytic approach to what you're watching. I think you use the term in your book, you get into an aesthetic trance. And I use the phrase, I get into flow, right? When I'm watching a movie, I lose time is another phrase that people like to use. Like I just forget what time it is or where I am, right? And so like there is a kind of a non-analytic experiential piece to that. And I like that as well. So what I have a hard time with is like turning your brain off, where you can just get into that flow. You talk about that a little bit when you're appreciating art at a museum, where you're not looking at the brushstrokes, you're looking at the whole, right? So particularly we were talking to philosophers here. How do philosophers like get into a state where they can get into that aesthetic trance, where they can get into that flow, where they're not constantly in their heads and trying to analyze everything? And I use the example of vacation, right? That those are really tricky, I think, for people that are more analytical, particularly as they approach art.
Yeah, no, these are like as central questions to aesthetic experiences as they get. So it's really, really great stuff. Maybe the first thing I should say is that aesthetic trance, I use that term more pejoratively a little bit. So
Okay.
aesthetic experience is like an aesthetic trance, but it doesn't happen that often, right? I mean, most of the time it doesn't. And I use this metaphor of like a wave crashing over us or something. That can happen, but it doesn't happen very often. And it's great when that happens. And maybe there's this one song that you feel when you first listened to it, it was just really moved you, and you were in an aesthetic trance. And the same thing when you listen to it for a second time, and maybe the third time as well, but maybe not the fourth time. And then the question is, what's going on now? Are you doing something wrong? Are you not paying? Are you not? Are you somehow having an off day, or maybe you're just not doing what you're supposed to do? And I actually think that it's those cases when the aesthetic experience goes wrong. So you know that you could have, or you can have, because you used to have an aesthetic experience in face of that object or that song. But I think it's very often people kind of blame themselves. And again, that goes back to the own analytic point. So that I don't think it's only philosophers. I mean, philosophers I think are more prone to doing this. That they constantly analyze what they're doing, but it's everyone. I think everyone has a tendency to do this, not just philosophers. And then, of course, the question is to find some kind of. I don't think the aim is to kind of fully switch off the analytic tendency, because I'm not sure that we can do that. But rather to somehow keep a balance between the two things, so that you're kind of monitoring whether you're doing it right, and then you can let go and just enjoy what's going on, and you focusing again on what's happening around you. So I think it's perfectly fine.
Yeah, that's and again, it can be very, very tricky. Let's talk a little bit about your work as a critic, because I think it's going to relate to what we just talked about. So, you describe in the book how you did that critical work. You sat on these boards and try to evaluate movies, and there was a dynamic that was created there that you felt was unhealthy for actually appreciating film as a discipline, as an art form. Um, have you ever had that experience? And I shouldn't. I'm asking this rhetorically, but I'm sure you have, where you're watching a film and you feel like you have to have a reaction to it, a very specific reaction. It's very popular. People love it. The critics love it. You're watching it, and you kind of feel like you have to love it, and you have to feel like you have to get into that aesthetic experience where you appreciate it for what it is. But as much as you're trying, and you had mentioned this earlier when you were making your comments, you try to have that experience, but you don't. How do you handle that, both as a critic, as a film critic, but also as someone who wants to enjoy films and enjoy movies? Because again, like now we're back in our heads. Now we're trying to manufacture something rather than just approaching that piece of art for what it is. And I'm going to just nuance this one other way. Before I watch a movie, I tend to read reviews. I just do. Like I have very limited time, and if I'm going to spend my time on a movie, I want to spend my time on something that I think I'm going to be able to get into an aesthetic experience with, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to waste my time on something that I only have 2 hours in the evening. I don't want to waste it on something that's not going to get me there. So I can't help but being influenced by what I'm reading, the judgment side, but then I still want to set that judgment aside and get into that experience. So what I'm asking you is, how do you do it? So you've been on both sides of this, and you are on both sides of this. What is your process for ensuring you're looking at a movie with fresh eyes, but also like dealing with all the critics and the reviews and all the rest of it?
So that's a great question, and let me just say something about the why being a film critic is really a messed up thing to do. And if you like films, maybe you should not become a film critic.
Yeah.
It's because if you have to write about a film, then you watch the film, and you can't just let the aesthetic experience happen as it would happen. You have to constantly think about what you're going to write and how you're going to write about it. And especially when in a kind of a film festival setting. Film festivals are great. They're really great events, and I miss them very much. I don't, obviously, in the last 2 years there were not many of them, and
Yeah.
but there's one thing. So if you're a critic, you very often you watch the film, and after that you have, I don't know, an hour, 1.5 hours, and you have to write a review about it, because that's just the time pressure. So you don't really have. I mean, you can't really like watch it twice. You can't really, watch it and then take your time and kind of think about what you're going to write about it. You have to somehow share your attention between actually enjoying the film and already putting together the article about how you're going to write about it. And that's just not good. That's really goes against the enjoyment. So if you care about films, don't become a film critic. It sounds like a glamorous thing, but it's not. It's really not.
Yeah.
But I think that the more general point that you're raising, that's a really important question, whether or not you're a film critic. And that's so just to rephrase what you were saying, you're going in to watching the film having some kind of expectations about what it's going to be. Is it going to be a fantastic masterpiece, or is it going to be a trashy, a lowbrow something? And that's going to really influence how you're going to watch it. And how can you kind of navigate that, your expectations and what's actually hits you from being there in the cinema. And I think it's I think exactly these kinds of scenarios are the ones that because of which we really should think of our aesthetic engagement as something active. So when we very often are so let's suppose that you go to the cinema and everyone, I don't know, it's an Oscar-winning film, or it's won the Cannes Film Festival, and you know that it's great stuff, but you don't seem to be. It doesn't. Nothing happens. It's just not happening. It's not. You're not getting anything out of it. So what are you going to do? You're going to. I think that just the human tendency is to try harder, to try like, hey, I'm doing something wrong. I should be, I don't know, paying attention to something else, or I'm missing out on something. I should do something. But I think it's really important that it doesn't mean that it's something wrong with you. And remember the earlier example that I gave about listening to a song that you used to, you loved it for the first time, for the second time, but it's just kind of it fades a little bit after a while, right? And you can't. Aesthetic experience is a weird thing because you can't just somehow guarantee that it's going to happen. So that's a big difference between an aesthetic experience, an experience of, let's say, the color red. If I put a red, there's nothing red here. If I put a red piece of paper in front of your eyes, you're gonna have a red experience. And there's nothing that I can put in front of your eyes that's going to guarantee that you can have an aesthetic experience.
Mm-hmm.
So aesthetic experience, the way I like to think about aesthetic experience, it's an interaction. It's not some kind of a reaction to what you do. It's a back and forth that you're doing there. So so here is the artwork. Let's say the cinema, the film that you're watching in the cinema, and then you're trying to approach it in a certain way. The film might respond that somehow, and you're doing something else, and so on. So it's this kind of back and forth. So the way I like to think about it is like it's like dancing with someone, or kissing with someone. So it's some kind of back and forth between the artwork and you, and that's why it's so important in our life. That's why aesthetic engagement is so important in our life. It's very different from all kinds of other engagement with the world.
Yeah, and that raises a lot of other challenging things too, because you bring something to that engagement. So if you've had a bad day or you've eaten something that's upset your stomach, you may be watching a really great film, one that in other circumstances you would react very differently to, but your environment or your environmental situation has caused you to react in a very specific way, right? And that doesn't mean the film's bad. It means the interaction that you had with the film was poor, right? And that's also really, really difficult. So, and I think that's something that I see with critics a lot, is that they will write about their experience, and not necessarily the technical aspects of the film, but if they'd watched it on a different day, maybe they would have had a different interaction with it, right? And
Well,
that's
that's
also very,
some form of critic. Yeah, some critics do this, and they basically just write their own experience.
yeah,
I think it's a bit of a cheap way out of the task of writing a
sure.
review, to just how you
Yeah.
felt.
One of the things you said about critics in your in chapter 5 is that a good critic should guide you to aspects of the film that may or may not cause you to change your viewpoint. So you were talking about humor in that context, I believe. And if you're reading a critic, their goal as a critic should be to say, hey, did you see this piece of the film? Or did you see the way that the director did this? Or did you see how the actor brought this out, right? Um, can you point to any critics that are doing that well today? Because I read a lot of critics and there's not a lot that I really appreciate. I'm going to use Roger Ebert. He's an easy one. For me, I always resonate with his reviews because in my opinion, he kind of did that. Like he was trying to call out things about the movie that you should look at, things you should notice. Now, obviously, he was critical. He was talking about whether it was done well or done poorly, but he did a really good job of kind of bringing in background material. And did you know that this actor performed in this movie and they brought some of that into this other movie? Those kinds of things were really helpful to appreciate or show why the film was not done well. Do you think there are any critics writing today that do that really, really well, so that like our readers could reference those before they go into a film?
Yeah, I think that there's one person who's really good at this, who's active these days, and that's Jonathan Rosenbaum. So he's a little off mainstream. It's the incredibly highbrow.
Okay.
So it's all the critics, they do the top 100 films of the year, and his top 100 films are like no one, 99% of the population would not have heard of I don't know, like any of them. But even when I was going to the festivals basically all year round, I probably knew about a third of it. So so it's not. I'm not sure that he's kind of few, but he does review some films that are out. I mean, he likes to review foreign films. And he almost never reviews Hollywood, but he's very good at this. So if there's a film that he does write a review of, it's really that you're watching, that's really worth paying attention to. But that I guess that takes us to the whole highbrow lowbrow thing. That's interesting. So the film festival. So there's two kinds of critics. There's the daily critics and the festival critics. And the daily critics, they basically have to, if their editor sends them to a film, they have to review it. The festival critics, they can basically review whatever they want, whatever they like. And I think that it's much easier and much better to write this kind of review about films that you like, right?
Yeah.
So to say that, well, pay attention to that, then it's all gonna all hang together. If it's a trashy, I don't know, action movie, then it's difficult to make comments like this, right? So it does have to do with the highbrow. That's why I think that the example that you gave earlier, the Nolan film, which one was that? Which one did you mention? The Dark Knight, right? Yeah. So I think that's actually all of Nolan's Batman films are really interesting in the sense that they are trying to capture two very different layers of the audience. I think they're obviously very explicitly going for the very wide audiences that lowbrow taste would go there anyway, because that's the new Batman movie. But they also, I think, in terms of the style of the film, they very explicitly are catering for highbrow tastes. So I think that, and I think there's more and more films like this, even more and more TV shows like this, that are doing this kind of crossover appeal for both highbrow and lowbrow audiences. I think it's a really interesting recent phenomenon that we should think more about.
Yeah, and that really does come down to writing and production, and the whole aspect of the movie production has to work together, right? That's why I think, in that series, I think the first two movies did that really well. The last in that series, I can't remember, The Dark Knight Rises or whatever. I just didn't like it at all. I had a very different reaction to it. Yeah, and I think it was because it was going more towards that populist side of the index
right.
versus.
I think that's right. Well, it's funny because that's the first one that I saw. I didn't see the first the first two. So from, I think if you haven't seen the first two, then you might have appreciated more the third one. But I think it's actually really difficult to pull off this kind of crossover thing, because if you really are catering for highbrow audiences, then you're going to alienate the lowbrow audiences. Yeah. And the other way around. So it's very difficult to capture all of these. So I think that many of the people who are successfully pulling this off, they use very lowbrow methods in some ways, maybe on the level of story, and highbrow methods in a different aspect of the film. For example, I don't know, image composition or something like that, or the narrative. And so they really kind of detach the two things, the highbrow narrative and lowbrow jokes or something. So it's I think there's a lot that's a relatively recent cultural phenomenon, not just in films, also in music and literature that we should think more about.
Yeah, that sounds great. I did want to ask you, so you're using the term films that you like. I want to relate that to aesthetic experience, and then I want to ask you personally, like what I was going to say, what films do you like? But that doesn't sound like an aesthetic way to say that, right? I was going to ask it in a more philosophical way, like what films get you into an aesthetic experience, and ones maybe that do that you can watch them multiple times, or and we can talk about a category or we can talk about specific films, but I want to get your take on when you look at a movie, when you go to the movies, or you want to pick a movie, are there movies you always go back to? Like, I want to feel something right now. I want to get into that experience. I want to lose time. I want to get into an aesthetic trance. So I'll watch this movie or this set of movies or whatever. Can you talk a little bit about that for you
Sure,
personally?
definitely. So I'm yeah, I like these boring 60s black and white French and Italian movies where nothing happens. So this is
Okay.
kind of that's my home turf, I guess.
Yeah.
So films by directors like Antonioni and Godard, and that's my comfort zone. But these days, there are very few films like this are made in Europe or in America. But very similar films are made in various other countries. So Iran
Hmm.
was really strong in that general style of films in the 90s. And then later on, in South America, in Latin America, there were a lot of films that went with this. A lot of Korean films that are really interesting from that point of view recently. And I don't really mean necessarily the ones that got really popular, Squid Games. Well, that's not a film, but a TV show, but uh, or um, or Parasite. Those Parasite I think was very interesting visually anyway. But so I think that many of the best films these days are not coming from Europe or America, but from various other parts of the world. There's a lot of really good films coming out of Thailand, Taiwan, Malaysia, places like this. So
And when you say some of the best films are really good films, when you're using those judgments, are you those are judgment?
films that
Yeah.
I like, right there. I should have said
Yeah.
that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Films that
And what is it about those films that get you into that aesthetic experience? So when you're sitting there watching for 2 hours, hour and a half, whatever, however long the film is, are you absorbed? Like, do you get into that interaction that you were talking about earlier, or are you looking at it more technically? Because like what you were just describing is a more technical, like maybe a
Oh,
perceptive thing. Right?
no, no. I think I mean I think the whole attention to the technical stuff that comes later, and that's more on the it's more the what you call the analytic approach, which I think can, again, as you pointed out, can go against enjoyment. But no, I mean what I mean is just that I mean I remember that the first time I saw a film that just kind of blew me away. I was 16, I think, and I went to this. That was an Antonioni retrospective, and then I just watched the film, and it's just each of the frames were as if they were paintings, and it's just amazing to look at. It's just every single shot was just put together in a way that just blew me away. And there was another shot, and it was just sheer beauty. So so yeah, I think I really care a lot about the visual sides of thing, and I think that's the reason why films hit us so hard is because of the visual aspect, right? And I think that the visual side of things should not be ignored. I mean, I think the narrative is very important and it can be very interesting. And we talked about Nolan, and I think Nolan is doing really fun things with the narrative. But in itself, that's not really enough, or it's not always enough. And I think that the visual sides are very important and should not be ignored.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's go back to that. Let's go back to that topic because you said you wanted to talk a little bit more about that, and I also find that very interesting. This kind of hybrid between
Mm-hmm.
highbrow and lowbrow, where there's a lot of things being done with camera or script or whatever, but they introduce some humor that might be a little bit more populist, or some devices that are more populist. Well, let's talk about television if you don't mind, just for a second. One of the series that I really, really got into a few years ago was the first season of True Detectives, and it was really popular. But to me, it was like the script was very well written. Obviously, the acting was phenomenal. There was some really beautiful cinematography, and the fact that it was about a brutal topic in a lot of ways, right? And the fact that it was so popular, and there was so much high expectations for the following two seasons, was really kind of interesting, right? I don't know if you've seen these series, but they're really, really well done. And in my opinion, the first season of True Detectives is one of the best TV series I've ever watched. And it does kind of toe the line between those two things, right? It's very philosophical. It's very, it's about the human condition. It's about these tortured detectives, blah 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 blah. But the craft of the TV series, the craft of making those movies is also extremely high and well done, in my opinion. Obviously, that's my take on it, right?
No, I actually fully agree with that, and I think that TV is a really good source um, of exactly this kind of what I call crossover culture when you're trying to reach highbrow and lowbrow audiences at the same time. And I mean, True Detective, I would say is really more on the highbrow side. I mean, I think it's fairly highbrow for a TV show, and there's I guess maybe since the early 2000s, there's been a couple of TV series that are really kind of branded as quality television, right? Wire, and I guess True Detective is one of them. And and I think that that's more highbrow, maybe kind of veering into middlebrow. What really interests me is when it's like really when there's like really trashy stuff there. So I think it's a really good genre of television, and I should say that TV is a really good case to look at. So not just cinema, but TV. Very often, interesting things, formal interesting things happen in TV before they happen in cinema because it's cheaper in some ways.
Yeah, yeah.
Easier to experiment. So one important subdomain of TV production is sitcoms. So sitcoms are by definition trashy, aren't they? I mean, they're like, that's the TV people. They take sitcom to be the lowest form of television, maybe just a little bit higher than soaps.
Yeah.
So, but I think that there's a lot of sitcoms that are doing exactly the same kind of trick. So they stay sitcom, they stay funny. People tune in because they keep the general structure of sitcoms. And people tune in because they want to watch a good sitcom. But nonetheless, they do much more interesting and much more exciting stuff with it. So Arrested Development is a famous example of that, right?
That's one of my favorite series. Yeah.
So Arrested Development is a sitcom, right? It has that's the genre. I mean, if you look it up on Wikipedia, it says Arrested Development, sitcom, and so on. So, but it's also it's very clearly, and so it's trying to capture the lowbrow audiences that keep it on air. Maybe not so successfully because it was canceled after 3 seasons. But they definitely try to do that. But at the same time, they're very deliberately and self-consciously are trying to do extremely highbrow things on the level of narrative, on the level of connections between different episodes and different seasons, and little um, like themes coming up here and there. And I think that's very interesting because it's part of such a lowly genre. And
Yeah.
there's a bunch of other examples. So there's probably less well known is a sitcom that was on NBC called Community.
Oh yeah, I watched a few of those. Yeah.
So that's also I think very clearly is trying to go for that effect. The sad thing is that many of those are canceled because they can't really pull off. They go too highbrow and then they kind of they lose the wider audiences. But sometimes they do manage to pull it off. So and
Do you
it's not
know
just
the?
sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was going to ask. Do you know the British movie In the Loop? It stars Peter. What's his name? Peter Vivaldi or whatever. And he was in a TV series. It's about politics. And it's a comedy. Like in a lot of ways, it's just absolutely hilarious. But it deals with some very like deep political subjects. And that series, the producer did Veep, a
Oh yeah.
comedy series in the United States.
Uh-huh.
Is same producer, and they deal with politics in a very similar way, right? They're talking about really really serious issues, but they do it in a way that's absolutely gut bustingly funny, and that's a hard thing to pull off, but it is intellectual, like particularly In the Loop. You have to really think about what's going on to get the humor. I mean, for me, a lot of British humor is that way. Like you have to really think about it
Yeah,
in order
definitely.
to really appreciate it. There's a surface humor, but then when you actually see what they're doing, they kind of go. You kind of get the intellectual part of why that's so funny. So that I was just going to ask if you had seen that because that kind of really
I'll
terrific
definitely
example.
look out for it. I mean, it seems like it's
I'll send you a couple of links. Yeah, yeah, it's really worth watching. It's fantastic.
Yeah, so you mentioned examples where what's highbrow is the content, right? Because it's about some serious political or maybe philosophical issues, and what's lowbrow is the way it's presented. So those can work, but I think that often that doesn't really make me like genuinely crossover culture from my point of view, because the content is in some ways, I mean, from a yeah that's easier to get
Yeah,
away
fair,
with
fair.
than other
I know.
forms. I think that
Yeah,
very often what happens, for example, in sitcoms, is that it's sitcoms, they're jokes, and the jokes can be trashy. But what is very complex and highbrow is the narrative. So there's this
yeah,
extreme narrative weirdness that goes on, even in somewhat trashy sitcoms, like in How I Met Your Mother. I'm not sure whether you know How I Met Your
yeah.
Mother.
Yeah. Uh,
This was, extremely popular sitcom, CBS, and some of the episodes were extremely complicated in terms of narrative structure. So I think, and they didn't manage to lose fans. So that's a kind of an
yeah,
impressive thing.
that is really tricky to pull off. Really,
Yeah.
really hard. That's interesting. Um, I want to go. I want to talk a little bit about philosophy of perception, if you don't mind. We don't have a
Sure.
whole lot of time left, but I wanted to get into a little bit of this because I think some of these subjects provide the foundation for what we're talking about. And when we talk about like how do you approach art, how do you approach film, those kinds of things, I think there's some of the things you unpack in your book really directly relate to this. Um, so one of the things I want to talk to you a little bit about is normativity, and you really come down hard on this idea that there should be a normativity to aesthetic experiences where some are always good and some are always bad. And there, like when I studied epistemology, right, and I used to be a hardcore,
Sure.
analytic epistemologist where there's truth and there's falsity, back when I was in my 20s, and I got in my 30s and 40s, like I abandoned that because you kind of have to, right? So a little bit more postmodernist leaning now, right, where you bring a lot to the table and you interpret what you're seeing and all the rest of it. And so for someone to say this is absolute truth is a very tricky thing to say, for anybody, right? And now in certain contexts, obviously it's easier than others. I used the example when I was writing to you, saying that God exists versus saying I believe God exists are two very different statements, right? It's a lot
Yeah.
easier to make the second statement than it is the first. So when it comes to aesthetics, I use the example in my letter to you of, people generally would prefer to live in a what we call a nice house where it's well kept and it's painted and it has flowers and it smells good and so versus a burnt out derelict shack, right? Now, I would say people like to go into a beautiful home because they have an aesthetic experience being there. Now, they might not think of it that way, but they enjoy, right? They don't like going into a derelict, burnt out shack that smells like refuse and all the rest of it because that aesthetic experience is awful. It's kind of clearly not a good aesthetic experience. But that to me seems to beg of norms, right? There's certain things that we would say 99% of the people would like and 99% of the people would hate. There are notable exceptions, but those types of aesthetic experiences seem to be normalized across the human condition.
Yeah.
Um, Talk about that. Like, what am I missing? Is there something that's not correct there, or how would you think about that kind of thing in terms of normativity?
Good. So the first thing I want to say is it's just that I fully agree with you that choices like this are aesthetic choices. So choices about how you furnish your houses are aesthetic choices. So just maybe I should have clarified this at the beginning that when I think about aesthetics, that doesn't mean that you're reading Proust or something like that. That's one form of aesthetic experience. But aesthetics is really part of our everyday life, and there's just so many choices that we make on a normal working day that are aesthetic choices about what shoes to wear and I don't know whether to walk down this way or this way, or maybe this way is longer. It might be a little nicer. So our life is full of aesthetic choices and full of aesthetic, kind of
Yeah.
sometimes tiny little bit, sometimes bigger aesthetic experiences. So I'm fully with you that I like the example of the house thing. And I will say this. So although it might be true that 99% of people might go for a a non rotten egg smelling burnt out house over one that is burnt out and it's really terrible and derelict. But within that, I think that there's going to be a lot of variability about, how, what kind of, and lots of people are going to just really hate what might be your ideal house. Maybe you like modernist, minimalist style, where there's, empty walls and very kind of functional furniture or something like that. And they love the ornate, I don't know, little baroque interior. So, or the other way around. And there might be this kind of this very general statements like this, that you probably don't like the smell of feces, right? And probably most people won't like the smell of feces, and they like the smell of roses, right? That's a generalization that you can't say. But what I mean, but within but that would really not be the kind of the good starting points for thinking about aesthetic normativity. Aesthetic normativity should be about like how, or I think that what we should avoid is statements like, the smell of rose is good and the smell of tulips is not good, and one should go for the smell of rose is not for the smell of tulips. But also, I mean, I feel that. All right, let me just kind of back out a little bit and say something about normativity. I think that aesthetic normativity, so ethics is about normativity, right?
Yeah.
It's about, or normative ethics is about normativity. It's about, what is good and what is bad, and what is it? This is, I should do this and I should not do that. I should not steal. I should donate to charities. I should not murder people. I should help refugees, and so on. And it's very tempting to do in aesthetics what people do in ethics, and to say that, well, when I go to the cinema and watch this film, then I should have a certain kind of experience. And I think that's both misconstruing what's going on. It's also just extremely harmful, because if I feel this kind of normative pressure, then it's just going to make aesthetic engagement just less fun. And very often, you just maybe don't. And I feel that we have so much normative pressure on us, like in all parts of life, all these kinds that you can't do. You can't shoplift, you can't beat up policemen. So it's like there's so many things you can't do, and there's so many normative constraints. At least when we're in the cinema, then maybe we can have some kind of take some break from normative pressure on us. So that's what I was trying to capture. But I also, I mean, I think that there's a really deep point here about normativity, and there's various ways of getting about it. One thing that we didn't talk about yet is that basically everything that so aesthetics as it is done in philosophy departments in the US and in Europe is Western aesthetics.
Yeah.
The Western aesthetics is very much obsessed with normativity. So they are going in for this kind of mirror claim between ethics and aesthetics in a big way. And Kant was huge on normativity. He actually thought that aesthetic experiences or aesthetic engagement has this kind of interpersonal normativity. So not only when I don't know, when I have an engagement with an artwork, I should have a certain kind of response. I should also somehow this response should have some kind of universal applicability. So everyone else in the world should have that kind of response. And that's just really underappreciates the differences in the way different people in different parts of the world engage with the same artwork. And that brings us to the importance of non-Western ways of thinking about art and artworks. And in the non-Western aesthetic traditions, normativity is much less important. So you were mentioning the hut that smells of garbage, and I was giving you another example of that, like no one likes the smell of dung. Well, in like a famous text in Japanese aesthetics, there are many aesthetic experiences are described, and some of them had to do with the smell of excrement and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think that the point is, if you have, I mean, really, all I wanted to say is get your aesthetic perks where you find them, and let no one judge you. If you find a certain thing aesthetically valuable, if you find a certain thing resonate with you, that's good. That's already in itself, that's a good thing. And you should not somehow feel censored because the rest of society doesn't think so.
That's a really good word. I think that's a perfect place to end because of what you said earlier. We're under so much pressure these days to be normative in everything else in our lives. And if we can't be non-normative in the things that we love and appreciate, then we're really in trouble. So I think it's a great spot to end our conversation. There's so much more I'd love to unpack with you. This has been really a lot of fun for me. And I knew we would run out of time. I just knew it because there's so much here. So maybe down the road sometime when you have some time, we can
Yeah, that would be
regroup
great.
and talk about some of this other stuff. I really do appreciate your time, Bence, and thanks for joining us. And I hope we get to talk again sometime soon.
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much.